Howdy film fans, let me show you a couple sets of figures. These first ones are the budget and the box office from the 1972 film The Godfather. Pretty good, right? At the time of its release and in the year of its release, The Godfather was the highest grossing film of all time. It would soon be surpassed by the likes of Jaws and Close Encounters and Star Wars, but for a few years, there it sat as the highest grossing film of all time. Now let's look at these figures. What you're looking at here is the budget and the box office for the 1982 film One from the Heart, also directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Now, that box office number is staggeringly low, and that might be the first thing that grabs your attention. How could a Coppola film, his first film after Apocalypse Now, have made so little money? And that's an interesting question, and one that I won't get into that much in this episode, but I will in the conclusion to the series. But the other number is just as important to think about, and that's the budget. $26 million. That's 4 times the budget of The Godfather. Why? Why the huge jump? I want to talk about budgets, and more importantly, I want to talk about director hubris in this, the penultimate episode of The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood. Before we get started, a couple quick caveats. Number one, Hollywood budgets, and even more so Hollywood box office, these are notoriously slippery numbers, and there are a lot of reasons for this that fall under the umbrella of what's often called Hollywood math, sometimes Hollywood accounting. And the reasons for this are too numerous to go into. If you're interested, I might do a video on that sometime. But Hollywood figures, Hollywood studios, Hollywood production heads hide money. And there's this very sort of calculated balance between the desire to have a hit, in which case you want to broadcast, ooh, the Avengers made $1 billion, but also not to sort of, shout out loud how much money your film made, because oftentimes the amount of money that people are owed, writers and others, depends on how much the film makes. And so if a studio can say, well, this is the box office, they don't have to pay out as much, even though the money is rolling in. And I only say that because in this episode, I'm going to be talking a lot about the sort of contrast between budget and box office in some late 70s, early 80s films by the New Hollywood directors. And you might go out and do your own research and find different box office numbers elsewhere. Most of these are based on Box Office Mojo, which is fairly precise, but you might find different accounts elsewhere. Also, when we consider box office, are we considering year of release, subsequent releases, retrospectives that come out years later? Are we considering the full amount of money that a film made, including sort of home video rentals, streaming, and all that sort of stuff? Different websites will give different numbers, different books will give different numbers based on those factors. Just keep that in mind as I go through this episode, because you might, as I said, find other numbers elsewhere. What will be the same regardless of where you look is the discrepancies between budget and box office that I'm going to show you. They might not be exactly the same, but they're going to be huge. And that's kind of the point of this episode. The second thing I just want to get out of the way quickly is that box office is not necessarily an indicator of a film's quality. Some of the films I'm going to be talking about today are good. Some of them are great. Some of them were not considered good or great at the time of release and have been revisited and sort of recontextualized and now are deemed good or great by a number of critics, scholars, fans, and so on. Why that happens is kind of too complex to get into, but it doesn't always have to do with the quality of the film. It can do with what audiences are ready for, what audiences are interested in, when a film is released, what other films is it released against, what else is going on in the country, the world, etc. A director who takes a big leap in terms of style or content and an audience that isn't quite ready to go there yet, but over time grows to be accustomed to that big leap. So there are a lot of reasons that go into why some of the films I'm going to talk about in this episode failed. But some of it does have to do with director hubris, and that's what I want to talk about first. First of all, what is hubris? You're probably familiar with this term, but in case you're not, just a quick definition. The simplest definition of hubris is excessive pride in one's self, an overinflated sense of self-worth. And this can come from somebody who has a lot of self-worth. In fact, that's where we often find it the most, in leaders, in heroes, in great artists, and so on. Hubris was one of the main flaws of Greek tragedy and of tragedy ever since then. Hubris is what drove Macbeth to believe that he could never be defeated. You know, no man of woman born will kill me. Hubris drives Thanos in the Avengers films. And it's important to note that hubris isn't just or only the sense of pride or overinflated sense of pride in oneself. It's the actions that derive from that sense. So in Greek tragedy, hubris would lead the hero to believe they could defy the gods. You can't defy the gods. That's part of what Greek tragedy is all about. Thanos has an overinflated sense of his own importance and his own self-worth. That's part of the hubris. But the flowering or the culmination of the hubris is his belief that his self-worth allows him to decide the fate of the universe, and that half of, all life or existence can be wiped out at his whim. That's the hubris there. So it's the sense of pride and then the defiant actions that happen as a result of that. What does this have to do with New Hollywood? Well, let's just kind of recast our eyes over what's been going on in the decade of the 1970s in relation to the directors. And I talk a lot about this in the Movie Brats episode, which you can find here. And I also talk a lot about this in the episode on auteurism in the 1970s, which you can find here. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but just to sort of refresh your memory, the first thing to remember is that in the late 60s and the early 70s, Hollywood as a business, as an industry, was suffering financially. The United States was in a recession in the late 60s, but Hollywood was in a deep recession. The old guard was dying off, the old studio heads, either actually dying or retiring. And there was a belief amongst filmgoers in America that those old studio heads had sort of lost touch with what audiences wanted. And so studios were bleeding money, and we've talked a lot about this. Then in the late 60s, you start to get these films that are low budget or even mid-budget, like The Godfather, $6 to $7 million. That would have been a sizable budget in 1971, 72. And these films are making tons of money, into the high tens, into the hundreds of millions of dollars, which was a lot of money back then. And all of a sudden the studios were like, we're flush again, right? So there's a sense that these films, these new Hollywood films, saved Hollywood. They saved the industry. Important point one. Second, while all of this was going on, auteurism as a popular notion was on the rise. It had broken out of this sort of cineast academia where it had kind of lived in the 60s and was a popularized notion that filmgoers knew about, film critics knew about, filmmakers knew about, studios knew about, and so on. This sense, and I'm oversimplifying here, that the film derived from the director. The director was responsible for everything of quality in the film. So if you put those 2 points together, you have these low-budget films that often work for a lot of different reasons that I talked about. Dede Allen's editing in Bonnie and Clyde, Gordon Willis's cinematography in The Godfather, and so on. These films making all this money are saving Hollywood, and the films are direct creations of these directors. The directors, ergo, saved Hollywood, right? So you have this sense, and I've mentioned this Paul Schrader quote a couple times where he's like, we would just walk into the studio head's office or walk into the producer's office and we'd say, sit down and let me tell you how I'm gonna make you some money. That was a real belief, and it came from the fact that in the early 70s, that's what those movies were doing. Yeah, I'm gonna make 5 easy pieces. What about a guy who plays piano? And it's gonna make a lot of money. I'm gonna make The Godfather, a pulp novel about gangsters. Gangster movies are dead. It's gonna make a ton of money. I'm gonna make a movie about a little girl who's possessed by the demon Pazuzu. Are you sure about that, Billy? Yeah. And it's gonna make a ton of money. It worked. And these directors began to believe that hype, that they saved Hollywood. And this is where the hubris comes in. And a transformation occurred somewhere in the mid to late 70s as a result of this. And as I have done in all of these videos, I do have to oversimplify a little bit because Martin Scorsese is a different person from Francis Ford Coppola, who's a different person from Hal Ashby, who's a different person from Peter Bogdanovich, who's a different person from Bill Friedkin, and so on. So obviously all of their individual cases are different, and what drove them to make the decisions they made in the late 70s, you know, was specific to their individual stories, but there is a commonality in the way they transformed from filmmakers who in the early 70s often professed to wanting to make personal films, independent films, in you know, independent spirited. They were studio films, but you know, something different. They wanted to tell personal stories, tell individual stories, and they did that, and they did that really well. And at some point, 76, 77, maybe in the wake of Jaws, maybe in the wake of Jaws' success, these directors started to decide, I want to make a grand gesture. I want to blow things up on an enormous scale. And the first one that was really successful that did that was a Coppola film as well, and that was Apocalypse Now. I don't want to talk too much about Apocalypse Now and its production and the way it went over budget and sort of Coppola's fever dream of making this film exactly how he wanted to make it. This has been well documented elsewhere, and if you haven't seen the documentary Hearts of Darkness about the making of Apocalypse Now, I highly recommend that film because it goes into quite a bit of detail about how complicated that film's development and production was. Also, Apocalypse Now isn't the earliest of the endeavors that I want to talk about in this video, but that's partly because its development and production took so long. So here you have Coppola over in the Philippines on more than one trip, making this, you know, life's dream film, and everyone in Hollywood was aware that this was going on. So even though the film didn't come out until 79, and some of the flops I want to talk about came out in 77, 78, Apocalypse Now had already gone into development and pre-production before some of those other films came out. So in its own sort of sideways way, it was an inspiration for these other films. And just briefly, in a nutshell, Apocalypse Now is a modernized retelling of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and it's about the Vietnam War, and it's about Martin Sheen going to look for Marlon Brando, Kurtz, this guy who's a colonel in the US military who's kind of gone off the reservation, and the military wants him contained. So they send this specialist, Martin Sheen, to do that. And as he goes further and further up the river, things get more and more insane. And that's the film. And it's a kind of feverish fever dream of a movie. It's fantastic. Check it out if you haven't. But Coppola spent a lot of money on the film, and it went over budget, and horrible things happened. Martin Sheen had a heart attack. There was recasting in the film on several occasions. There was, all kinds of foibles or mistakes. They wanted to have real corpses in the scene, and they bought some from a guy, and he turned out to be a grave robber. They killed animals on the set, which you don't, But what Coppola delivered was a work of sort of rare genius. In some ways, it could be seen as the capstone of the New Hollywood era. I would say Raging Bull from the next year, but Raging Bull wasn't a big success. You could also maybe say Being There of the same year, 79. These were two new Hollywood films with new Hollywood directors, Being There, Hal Ashby, Apocalypse Now, Coppola. Both quirky films in their own way, both very much in the spirit of New Hollywood. Being There more, I think, because it is still the sort of personal and small budgeted film. But Apocalypse Now too, it is a very personal film once you get past the kind of the theatrics and the bombast of it. And it did well. So its budget ballooned incredibly, and it ended up coming in at 31 million for its budget, but it made 100 million. That's not the same ratio that you're getting with the Godfather films, but that's still pretty good, and that was a success. So what you have is other filmmakers in Hollywood who could point to Apocalypse Now and say, look what Francis did. Francis forced the studios to make this film, to let him make this film, this personal visionary piece of work. And even though it went over budget and people got sick and animals got killed and so on, he did it. He pulled it off because, why? He's Francis Ford Coppola. He is an auteur. He is a mad, visionary genius. What other films did the mad, visionary geniuses come up with at the end of the 70s? Let's look at a couple examples. All of these films have well-documented stories, and I'll put some links in the description below, and you can go and read a little bit more about them. But a lot of the filmmakers of the New Hollywood era who had made their names making small to medium budgeted films that then reaped huge box offices decided to make extravagant, highly budgeted, money pit kind of films. Not just big budgets because of special effects, big budgets because they were going to do it their way, on location, with specially designed sets, make this film that was different from their other films and do it their way because they were the auteur. One of these films was Sorcerer. This was William Friedkin's follow-up to The Exorcist. Now, Friedkin had made two films in the early 70s, The French Connection and The Exorcist. French Connection, Best Picture winner. The Exorcist, for a short while, was the highest grossing film of all time. These were two huge successes critically, commercially, and so on. And then Friedkin decided he wanted to do not a remake, but inspired by the film The Wages of Fear by Clouzot, a French director. And it's a film about a man who's in the jungle, who has to drive a truck full of dangerous substances through precarious situations across a crazy creaky bridge and where they might get attacked and so on. And Friedkin decided to go shoot this film in Peru, and it became a money pit. And for whatever reasons, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the conclusion to this series, people didn't go to see it. So, Sorcerer's budget ballooned up to $22 million, and it made back about $6. That is a bomb. That is a box office bomb. And now people look at Sorcerer, and this is regarded as, if not a masterpiece, a near masterpiece. Go into Friedkin circles, and people will often claim that this is his best film. For a long time, it was hard to get on sort of DVD or any kind of home video, although now it's available. And as more and more people are exposed to the film, they're like, wow, this is amazing. Why didn't people go? This is hard to answer, and like I said, I'll get into it more next time. But one of the things that happens when films start to go over budget, and I talked a little bit about this with Jaws, is that the Hollywood press smells blood. Because when a film goes over budget, it often, not always, but often means complications, problems. And those complications and problems often mean, not always, but often mean there's something wrong with the film. They went in before the script was ready. A performance isn't working out the way that it was intended. The director's kind of lost the plot in terms of holding the whole thing together. There's a variety of things that can go wrong, but when the Hollywood press smell this, it's like blood in the water, and they start to write about the film as a failure before it even comes out. Sometimes the film can overcome this, like Jaws did, like Titanic did. Sometimes a good film, like Sorcerer, is doomed by the reputation it accrues before it's even finished, before it's even actually a film. Ishtar, Elaine May's film, that's a great film. You know, it's not perfect, it's got its like flaws, but it's funny. Watch Ishtar, it's a really good film. But it was doomed by the bad press when out there in the desert, Elaine May, Warren Beatty, and Dustin Hoffman all started to go over budget for lots of reasons. So is that what happened with Sorcerer, or were audience tastes just starting to change by the end of the 70s? These things are hard to predict. If Hollywood knew how to predict exactly which audience would go to which film, then films would be a lot different. They try to predict it, and sometimes they're right. Probably a lot of people are going to go see Black Widow. Dating this video now. By the time you watch this, probably a lot of people went to see Black Widow. Certainly a lot of people went to see the 9th Fast and Furious film. Are a lot of people going to go see the next phase of Marvel films? There's new heroes coming in. They're less familiar, but people sure went to see the Guardians of the Galaxy. And that wasn't an incredibly familiar group of heroes when the film first came out. Who knows? But they didn't go see Sorcerer. Here are a few other films that Hollywood audiences decided just weren't for them in the late 1970s. New York, New York, Martin Scorsese's follow-up to Taxi Driver. Heaven's Gate, a 1980 film directed by Michael Cimino, that was his follow-up to the smashing success of The Deer Hunter. Hal Ashby, who'd had a great run in the mid to late 70s with Coming Home and Being There, then released Secondhand Hearts and Looking to Get Out, both of which were box office bombs. Even the darling of Hollywood for the last 50 years, Steven Spielberg, had what was considered a bomb at the time with 1941. 1941, the budget ballooned, like a lot of these other ones did, up to $35 million. It actually made its money back, especially with the international box office. It made nearly $100 million. But for a Steven Spielberg film after Jaws and Close Encounters, that was considered a failure. Why did all these films cost so much money? And why did they do so poorly? They cost so much money to make, in part because, as I said, the directors believed it was now their turn to make something special, make something distinctive, make something different. So they went on location to extreme places where it was difficult to film. I mean extreme in terms of filming there. like Friedkin with Sorcerer, or because they had to build expensive and lavish sets because they wanted to recreate New York in the 40s or Los Angeles in the 40s, and they had to spend a ton of money getting it exactly right. New technology was becoming more expensive. In the wake of Star Wars, people wanted films that looked really good in terms of their special effects. New cameras, new lenses. Michael Cimino insisted on doing all kinds of expensive, intricate camera work on Heaven's Gate that forced the budget to balloon on location. And at the time, there was still this lingering idea that these men, and it was only men who were given this opportunity, could pull it off, that they were geniuses, that they were, that they deserved it in a sense. And they believed that themselves, that who was some studio boss, who was some new upstart like Barry Diller, we talked about last time, to come in and tell them, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, William Friedkin, no, I'm putting limits on you. You can't put a limit on genius. Well, we see what happens. The films go insanely over budget, and then if the people don't go see them, they don't make their money back. And this is what happened repeatedly at the end of the 1970s. So much so that when you get to Heaven's Gate, it's famous for the film that bankrupted United Artists. It didn't destroy the studio because the studio was saved when Transamerica, who wanted to get rid of this bankrupted studio, sold it to MGM and Kirk Kerkorian, who we spoke about in the last episode. But the financial losses that United suffered because of Heaven's Gate and other decisions they'd made meant that it was no longer its own studio anymore. And ever since then, it's been part of MGM. Or everybody has a bomb once in a while, right? What's the big deal? The big deal is that as the studio realignment was cementing itself in the late 70s, which I talked about in a previous episode, these guys who came in, as I talked about in that video, were money people. They were no longer creatives, and they didn't have the patience for or the reverence for genius directors. They cared about the bottom line. So they didn't care if you were Francis Ford Coppola, director of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. If your film is going to go that far over budget and bomb, we're not going to make films with you anymore. Maybe we're not going to make this kind of film anymore. And this is where the importance comes in, is that so many of these films happened around the same time in a kind of 4-year window from 77 to 81. The country was undergoing a lot of changes during that time, which I'll talk about in the next episode. Audience tastes were changing. The hunger and thirst for a sort of darker, cynical approach to films that had kind of exploded in the early 70s had dulled or become wearied by so much darkness and cynicism that it seems like there was a thirst for something lighter, frothier, easier. All of this kind of stuff was going on as these directors were destroying their reputations and in a sort of case, in a case of history kind of biting them in the ass, their humbled reputations started to cast a negative light on the types of films that they were making. So if they, as directors, are going to benefit from their films having saved Hollywood in the early 70s, their films are going to suffer from their reputations suffering in the late 70s. So you get a studio landscape where the Barry Dillers and the new studio heads look around and they're like, well, we've got these less well-known filmmakers making Grease, Saturday Night Fever, blockbusters. Those films are making a ton of money. They're made by the book. Not that those films are bad or anything, but they're sticking to their budget, they're sticking to their shooting schedule, they're making a ton of money, they're high concept films, they're easy to package, they're easy to market. These guys are making these quirky money pits that nobody wants to see. Maybe that era is over. Maybe we don't have to, bow down at the altar of Francis Ford Coppola anymore. And the movies change, and the movies always change. We can't only blame the directors. There's audience tastes, there's studio imperatives, there's cultural shifts, so many different things. But these directors' behavior and the resulting failures damaged the notion of Hollywood as a place for independent, quirky, personal films derived from a personal vision. One of the sad byproducts of that is that a lot of these directors had a very tough time in the 1980s. They made films that are now deemed pretty good or even great, like Scorsese's After Hours. A lot of people now really love Coppola's Rumblefish. But these were films that didn't do that well in the blockbuster era. So it meant that the directors continued to have a sort of, sullied is probably too strong a word, but a kind of dented reputation. And it wasn't really until the 90s when there was kind of a rebirth of an indie spirit with people like Soderbergh and Hal Hartley and Quentin Tarantino that these directors kind of began to flourish again. So you get Scorsese coming back with Goodfellas, or you get Altman coming back with The Player, all in the early 90s. The only 70s directors that really kind of had financially and critically successful 80s were probably Woody Allen and, of course, Steven Spielberg, who had a gangbusters 80s. The rest of them had a tough time of it, even though, as I said, some of their films that they made in the 80s are now deemed to be great parts of their bodies of work. And these failures, One from the Heart was a failure. Look at that, it didn't even make $1 million. This was a massive failure. Today, it's not deemed Apocalypse Now or The Godfather, although you will find people who argue that it's Coppola's best film. Not a lot, but some. But it's certainly deemed not to be a failure as a film. It failed at the box office, yeah. But now people look at it and it's vibrant performances, it's beautiful cinematography, just the kind of dream world that Coppola created in the film, the music. It's important in production. It was one of the earliest films to use video playback on the set so they could watch what they were doing while they were doing it and not have to wait for dailies later. That's an important sort of production history around the film. But people look at it and go, yeah, One from the Heart's good. But they didn't think that at the time. Very few people thought that at the time, and nobody went to see it. And it was the end of Coppola's career as, kind of the greatest filmmaker in America at the time. And he's never regained that, even with a few sort of comeback hits here and there. Godfather Part 3 or Dracula or something like that. So the end, I guess, is that, yeah, the country was moving on by the end of the 70s. Reagan was right around the corner. A different era was coming. Studios were moving on. They had figured out the blockbuster model. They had figured out how they wanted to make money in a new era of studio conglomeration. And that stuff probably would have killed off New Hollywood eventually anyway. But when you have the sort of highest profile filmmakers of the era egotistically dumping other people's money into films that were then box office bombs, that created a huge reputational blemish on the concept of New Hollywood, and it never recovered. And by the early 80s, New Hollywood was over. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll be back with one more video in this series. It'll just be called Conclusion or Wrap Up or something like that, wherein I kind of talk about the other factors that I've alluded to here, the cultural changes, the political changes, and sort of the end of the New Hollywood era. And I've still got What Makes This Film Great. I should have another in that series coming up, and I keep alluding to this other new series that's coming up, and I'll have the first video on that soon. So if you stuck with me this long, I'd love it if you'd hit like, hit subscribe, share the video, drop a comment, all of that sort of stuff. It helps the channel grow, and I appreciate it immensely. Until next time, though, my name's Aaron Hunter. You know the drill. Keep watching movies.